This is the workshop for the foundational concepts for successful security and content audits in Domo. This is really from lessons learned when we had a NIST 800-171 audit at our company. My name is Dave Luna, and I'm running this workshop for you. So I am a senior technical specialist for data analytics at CAE USA. And CAE USA, we are a company that is a subsidiary of CAE Inc., the largest training and simulation company in the world. And we basically do the US DoD division of what CAE Inc. does. We build commercial aircraft simulators, military aircraft simulators. We have a lot of ground vehicle simulators for the military, as well as medical and surgery simulators in some of our other divisions as well. So we have a broad range of simulation and training devices, and therefore we have a broad range of the different types of data and information we use to design and actually utilize these simulators. So on the right hand side of the screen there, you see one of our aircraft simulators. Some of these are on motion and some of these are on the ground, and you'll often see these in movies where they have pilots come in and show you how they learned how to fly an aircraft. It's really neat to see our simulators on the big screen. We also staff training centers themselves, so the facilities where different pilots or vehicle operators or doctors will go to a training facility to use our equipment to actually learn their trades, we actually staff that with the instructors as well as create the course material. So we have a broad range of simulation and training activities. Now, some of our other simulators you'll see on the left-hand side of the screen. This is a tank engine simulator. We actually take a real tank engine and put systems around it which make it believe it's in a tank. So we have to deal with the real information and specifications of that equipment. On the right-hand side, you'll see some instructors and students in a drone simulator. So this is how they fly the MQ-19 Predator drones. We do the training and simulation for that as well. And in the lower right-hand corner, you've got some medical simulation. So you'll see here, you'll have VR applications that allow them to see what would be in the patient's body, as well as recording what they're doing with the medical procedures and that type of training. So the range of training we do goes from aircraft to medical to training devices, civilian, military, all kinds of different aspects. So a quick introduction of what we've been doing is over the last several years, we've been transitioning to a data-driven organization, and that comes with all of the baggage of learning what does it mean to be data-driven. So I'm a subject matter expert in systems engineering. So I run a lot of our complex programs. Because I have that experience of how the program works and what's really going on, I can look at the data and see what does it really mean. Now, because of that background, they actually had me take over Domo and really try and implement it for our company. That means I'm accountable for Domo, but it also means it's great when everything goes well, but I'm also responsible when everything doesn't go well. Passing compliance audits is something we've always had to do with our simulations to get them certified, but we never really had to do anything with data compliance things. So we basically made some incorrect assumptions while preparing for some of our audits, and I'm here to help you avoid some of those mistakes that we made during that audit, and we've learned our lessons. So I'm trying to help you with that. First of all, this discussion is not about cybersecurity. A lot of people hear that buzzword in society and they think cybersecurity is what audits are for. Well, people consider the common concepts of cybersecurity of how you set up your system, how your hardware set up, how your software set up to protect your system's integrity. And that could be things from multi-factor authentication to data encryption, physical security, who can actually access your hardware, physical security of that system, as well as virus protection, all of those basic things. Well, thankfully, since you're using Domo, you don't have to worry about that kind of thing. Domo has a very good system set up to address everything related to cybersecurity. There are 2 reports that are published by Domo annually, and they cover the different aspects of the security setup around your Domo instance, whichever instance you have. If you need these reports, you contact your customer success representative. They're published annually, and these are the reports that I provide to my security and my IT folks so they can read about what has Domo done to secure the physical system and all those cybersecurity type concerns. Those are covered by Domo, and they've done a great job doing it. What was our problem? What did we do wrong when we did our audit on NIST? And basically, the security reports covered IT, they covered the security, they covered cybersecurity. I'm good to go there. I looked at the security posture of the instance and the information we had in the instance. Everything with simulators and things like that. And then I ensured that our system was compliant with the level of security I needed for the information that was in there. And those were the assumptions I had. I figured I'd pass with flying colors, and boy, we were wrong. Those were bad assumptions. And I'm here to help you understand why. Our internal compliance audit team came in evaluating our compliance for what's called controlled unclassified information. And we'll define that a little bit deeper later. But the definition is really things that aren't classified, but they could be proprietary, anything like that. And we found that what we did for controlled unclassified information really applies to any kind of information you want to control, anything sensitive whatsoever. So it's just based on what law the thing you're trying to control is based on. Those are the rules you implement. But the discussion we're going to have today is about everything else going on about that controlled information. And that's the lesson I hope I can help you with. What derailed our audit is kind of embarrassing, pretty simple though. Our initial response to the audit for controlled unclassified information is, I don't have any. We don't put controlled information inside of our Domo instance. It's a cloud-based one, it resides off premises, and we actually don't really have a need to put our sensitive information out there. So anything that's controlled unclassified information, we just simply didn't load in Domo. I'm good to go. I satisfy all your requirements. I presented that to our auditors. Oh boy, was I wrong. What opened our eyes was the question they asked, how do you know that no one has uploaded any CUI data into your instance? And at that point, I couldn't disprove the existence of CUI in my instance. And I also couldn't prove users were trained that they weren't supposed to do that. So while I knew what was supposed to go in there and the system was set up, I couldn't prove it, and my users weren't properly trained on what could and could not go up into the instance. So that's where we got derailed. So our light bulb moment. If your organization interacts with any kind of controlled information, you really have to understand that even if your instance is not intended to house that information, because your organization deals with that information, you have to be prepared to survive an audit related to that information. What does that mean to survive an audit related to that information? Well, you have to have evidence that you've set your system up to address whatever controls are necessary for that information, and that your employees and your users are trained in how to deal with that information. You have to have evidence of auditing, training, ongoing reports, and basically prove to that auditor that you have correctly handled their information. We realize these concepts, they're related to basically any kind of sensitive information. So what I wanted to do is help you today with a few things related to whatever your information is. I hope to address the security and access controls that people usually forget about when they consider how to control their information. There's lots of ways where I can provide the concepts and solutions that are applicable to all types of controlled sensitive information. I will provide examples of just how we solve this in our Domo instance, and I'll show you some actual pictures of that. And I will highlight the existence of Domo functionality that's available to help you solve these issues as well. This information is going to be able to help you set up and maintain the foundation of your instance, even if you don't have controlled information in it. It's good foundational practices. And that's what I hope to do for you today. I'm going to start with the 4 foundational pillars for management of controlled information. And these apply to whatever kind of information there is. So first of all, how do you identify what the control requirements are for your sensitive information? How do you design and implement and document the required controls in Domo? And then how do you ensure that all of your stakeholders are trained and certified to access that controlled information? And then one of the most important pieces, how do you monitor and manage that your controls that you have implemented are actually implemented, secure, and actively used? So these 4 foundational pillars are what we're going to go through and cover. How do you cover yourself for a successful audit? So the first one, how do you identify control requirements for your sensitive information? I talked about our information was controlled unclassified information. So this is a quick little description of it as defined by the NIST standard. So it is really anything that has some kind of proprietary marking or a government release marking, something that means it's controlled, but it hasn't passed the threshold of being classified information like weapons performance or things like that. Some examples of that are common government distribution statements, and you find this throughout different government documents. Distribution A and B and C, and each one as you go down the letters has more and more controls and restrictions on it. So distribution statement A is basically publicly releasable, anybody in the world can have it. And then you get all the way down to you have to be on contract, you have to have the proper controls and access reasons to know to get access to those higher statements, but it's not classified information. So it's a realm of something is controlling that by definition. When you talk about other people's type of information, controlled information, our focus was on CUI, but the only difference between me controlling CUI and you controlling things such as HIPAA for health information or SEC rules for financial information, you have ITAR regulations for exports, and you also have controlled goods we deal with all the time from Canada, our parent company. Regardless of the rules and regulations for your information, each one of those rules will have a definition of what is that information and how you must control it. That's how you establish the rules you must implement in your Domo instance. The second foundational pillar is how do you design, implement, and document whatever those required controls were that were defined by the type of information you have. The understanding of who controls the system is a critical concept, and this really bit us hard at the beginning. So everybody talks about whenever you go to any of those regulations about what you're controlling, they're basically going to say you have to do XYZ to the system. Well, one of our weakest responses to the initial audit was, what is the system? There is a physical system and there is the functional system. The physical system is really about the computers that live in the Domo facilities, and they compromise your system. When you talk about physical access to the system, no one who works at my facility has physical access to walk up to the hardware and touch the front of the computer, hit the on-off switch, plug a thumb drive into it. The physical access to the system was completely outside of our control, which it would be outside of your control as well. The physical system is in Domo's domain. What we have control of is the functional system. What do our operators do with access to the system? How do they manipulate it? How did we set up our controls and access? Well, if you do not have a good, solid understanding of the differences between the physical system and the functional system, all of your regulations are going to say the system that contains this information shall do something, be controlled in some fashion. So with your auditors and with your understanding, you've got to lay down the foundation. What is the system? What is the physical system? And what is the functional system? Because you're only going to control half of that when it comes to Domo and a cloud-based solution of any kind. You also have to put yourself in the auditor's footsteps. The auditor is going to come up with questions, and if you can consider and anticipate the questions they're going to come up with and design your system to answer those, you're going to have a much smoother audit. These are some common questions to consider for an auditor. So who controls the information that's imported and exported from your instance, and how do you confirm they're authorized to do so? So the fact that I didn't authorize you to put controlled unclassified information into my instance. So can I tell when somebody does? Are the individuals controlling the imports and exports aware of the information that's allowed to go in there, any kind of restrictions or guidelines? If an authorized individual violated a guideline, does your system and the rules you've set up notify you that your rules have been violated? And then once something is uploaded, here's a big issue we had is who can access that system and who can access that information once it's uploaded into your Domo environment. So I'm going to show you some examples of how we prepared to answer some of these questions. So first of all, we created a standard default user login page. It's the landing page for all of our logins, all of our users, and it has all the announcements for what is allowed and what is not allowed to go in the instance. We really found it difficult to get people to stop and read the notifications that were on this page. So one of the things we actually implemented was a little message that says, do this or else XYZ is going to happen. So we would do things that would say, send Dave an email or we're going to turn off your access in 30 days. And anybody who didn't send me an email, we turn off their access. And then they would scream at us, how come I lost my access? Well, you didn't send me an email like it says in the instructions on the splash screen. We found many of them were just clicking right past it, moving on. If they don't understand what's on the notices and they get an audit question on it and they can't answer, how do you know this? You're going to fail your audit. So it was a neat little trick that helped us solve that problem. How do you get them to read the notices? One of the ways we implemented some of our controls in the Domo instance was to utilize the role management system that's available to you in your Domo instance. So using the role management, we actually created custom defined roles that had different accessibility based on the grants that were provided for each role. So by defining what each role was going to have access to, and then we would define which person was going to be in which role, we could then control what was actually available to each user based on their training and their need to access the information. After we defined the roles, we actually had to then define what data is allowed to be in the instance. And this is addressing that, how do you know nobody's uploaded the correct information into the instance? So we basically have mandatory training that explicitly states what is and is not allowed to be loaded in the instance. And then in that mandatory training, similar to our security training, you can train somebody what it means to handle classified information. And yet on the news all the time, you hear about people violating that training and committing espionage. So basically, the best you can do is train your folks in what the rules are, what the regulations are, and make sure they are aware of it. And then if they violate their training, it's actually on them that they violated their training. You still need to know it happened though. We created the mandatory training. We explicitly stated what information is and is not allowed. And then we went on to say for each of those roles we had, we created training for how do you share the information? What do you have access to? Now, here's a critical point that you should make sure your users all understand. We quickly found out that when somebody put information into Domo, they really didn't understand exactly who could and could not see their information. We had everything from once it's up there, everybody can see it, to others who believed once they put it up there, no one but me can see it until I shared it with them. So sharing in Domo is a complicated issue. It's very well defined in the roles and in the privileges given by defining the roles, but you have to make sure everybody's trained. When I have access to something, am I allowed to share that with anyone, or am I only allowed to share that to certain other authorized users? That's all covered in training material. We also attempted to limit the exports from Domo. So you go to all the trouble of setting up your instance, you define your roles, you train everybody in what their access is. Now you're good to go. You're auditing what's happening in Domo. And then someone exports to Excel one of your controlled files. Now you have no tracking of that file. It's external to the system. So we tried to teach everybody, you really want to work in Domo. You want to limit the exports out of Domo. And we want to monitor the imports into Domo so we know what's happening. So establishing all of that functionality and all that monitoring was something we did to satisfy the auditor. Some other auditor questions to consider. Who controls all the access to the information that's being controlled by these different levels of controls you put in there, and who reviewed those controls and approved them? You have to have your leadership's review and approval. Are the processes and controls that you're using reviewed periodically for changes? As your company changes and you have different levels of material coming in, have you updated your procedures and controls to handle that new information? Have you obtained and documented approval of your process? One of the things we did is showed them we established everything, and they said, thank you very much, but who authorized you to establish that way? Who reviewed it and approved it? And the main people who need to do that is the people who are responsible for the control data that you're actually protecting. So we actually had to have human resources sign off on everything related to Privacy Act information. Security had to check off anything for controlled classified information, export control for anything ITAR. So whoever the owning organization is for the information that you're trying to protect, they're the people who should be reviewing your processes and your controls and confirming that you've met the letter of whatever regulation is you're trying to satisfy. When you get to the how do you define the roles and who approved it, this is the way we solved that problem. So we created a spreadsheet that basically says, here are the custom roles we're making, and they're defined by a CA, the name of the company, and the activity of the role. CA Domo admin, CA major Domo, a lot of the common Domo terms. And then we used the different privileges and gave each of those roles access to it. So now here's our documented definitions of the roles. We then took this spreadsheet and circulated through all those data owners and had them review who we were going to give access to and what those people were going to do based on the role they were in. Once it was approved, now it's signed, it's an artifact we can give to the auditor to show that it was created in accordance with the rules, it was reviewed and approved by the stakeholders, and then we also have a periodic review of it to make sure that's still current based on our current requirements. One of the other things we needed to know is documenting why users were granted access at all. The fact that this person is in that role. Why is that person in that role? And who said it was okay for that person to be in that role and have that access? So what we did is we solved this problem by having a core concept related to all of our training. So when our training was finished, you had evidence that you were trained in how to do it, but the last slide in every training package had a little pop-up window that says, now that you've finished it, you need to send this information, and this is to one of our major domos. You type out your job title, why you need access, what your role is going to be, that we have a record that you completed the training for it, and now we have a record of why you were requesting training. We can then send your request for training to the appropriate person who owns the data you're trying to get to and get their approval. Yes, that person is trained, that person has been formally approved, and now you have a documentation trail. So now you can cover the auditor's question of, how do you know the people who are accessing this are properly approved to access it? So they're trained and you have a documentation trail. The third foundational pillar is you set everything up and all that. How do you make sure all your stakeholders really understand what they're supposed to be doing in there? They're trained and certified how to access this information. We solved this problem using the specific training packages created for each of the different roles. And you'll see here, this is on the left-hand side, is the training template, which shows which role requires which level of training. And each one of the green boxes at the bottom links you directly to the training package. On the right-hand side, you'll see in the training that there's several different roles, and each of those roles are defined. So everyone knows, regardless of the role they're in, what is the function of the other roles. So you know the scope of what your access is and why you're in that role. We created all this training using Course Builder. So Domo provides a free app called Course Builder, and we created all of our training in Course Builder, and our training lives directly in Domo. So when people log into Domo, they get initial access. The first thing that gets shared with them is the training package, which gives them the first level of access above a social user. When they've completed that training, they submit for the next level of access if necessary. But before they're given that access, they have the next set of training to do. But all of this is completed in Course Builder. Wonderful tool, free application provided by Domo. For tracking all of our training, we needed to prove to the auditor that all these people have been trained. So we actually incorporated Google Analytics directly into our Domo instance using our Course Builder training material. So now we can track which courses people have taken, how long they spent on each slide, what they scored on each test. We actually have evidence, statistical evidence, that shows they actually completed their training. We can also track all of the training records. Because we have Domo tracking the Google Analytics, we can actually set up everything to give us alerts when someone finished a training package. So we don't have to sit there and monitor training all the time. Domo monitors training for us. Google Analytics captures the information, statistics, time on card, test scores, everything like that. Now, when that email is sent, before we even get the email, we already get the alert from Domo saying person ABC has completed level X training. So we already know to expect that email. And in fact, when we get an alert that somebody completed their training, if we don't get the email, it actually prompts us to say, wait a second, you finished this training. Why haven't you asked for your access? So we don't monitor training. Alerts monitor training and tell us when people are changed status or requested access. Great use of alerts to solve our problem. The fourth pillar is really, how do you monitor that all this stuff you set up is actually working? Those controls are active. They're controlling what everybody does, but you've implemented these rules, and how do you know they're working to control your sensitive information and that nobody's breaking any of these rules? The auditor questions are going to come in as, can you produce evidence that these approved processes are actually controlling everything? Can you produce examples of what happens when someone tries to perform an unauthorized action? These are some of the questions that at first were very hard to answer. We solved that with more Domo alerts and actually access to the activity logs. So what we do is we use the monitoring of user accounts from the activity logs. We monitor everything from the last time you logged in, login of non-employees. We'll get to that in a second. Boy, that's a good example. Former employees, when they leave the company, when you shut off their access, well, did they own cards? Did they own data flows? Did they own material that now needs to be transferred to somebody else to maintain that control? And then also the creation of new users. We use single sign-on, so it actually, to create a new user, the person just logs into Domo, it bounces their login credentials off of our IT and gets validated multi-factor authentication and grants them access to a social user account. Then we train them and give them advanced access to participant accounts. So when we're monitoring the activities of users, we actively monitor users by assigned roles, how many of each kind of role we have, and when a person changes from this assigned role to that assigned role. We equate that to, have you had the proper training? The other information we have is, how do we access the information for non-admins, for all of the people that are out there who don't have full access? They need to know what cards are available, what are the roles of other people, who do I go to for information? Well, if you have limited access due to the role you have, we actually also developed a way to produce the information and cards that showed everyone what's in Domo, so they could actually know what's there without actually having access to it. So the auditor comes in and they're going to say, well, how do you know that users are following these established roles? They're following these processes. How do you know if any of your controls are being violated or ignored? How do you know if any of the approved controls have actually been altered without approval? Somebody jumps into the role assignments and changes one of the access roles. Do you have any metrics or statistics to show that the controls are actually working, that you're controlling people's access? Or if any approved control results in a trigger or a notice that something did go wrong, do you have any evidence that you did something about the violation of the rules? These were some tough audit questions as well, and let me show you how we solved them. Active tracking of user actions. So the activity log logs everything anybody does. Whoever they are, whatever they view, whatever they do is logged in the activity logs. It's a gold mine of information. I highly recommend that everyone gets familiar with what's in the activity log and how to use it. So we used our activity log, and we now have active monitoring all recently exported data. So if somebody's sending things out of the instance, we are watching what goes out. Somebody's exporting controlled data, flags on special data, so when that one gets exported, it actually sets off an alert to us. Active monitoring of newly imported data. This is actually making sure that no one has violated the rules about importing an Excel file or connecting some other data set that isn't authorized to be in our instance. So if anybody creates a new import, a new file or a new connection, we actively get told, the monitors get told of what's been going on. Now, we also have activity of all non-employees, and these are really the Domo support folks. When you have controlled information, your auditor is going to want to know, how do you know who's controlling this information and that nobody who's not in your control is accessing it? Domo has access to your instance, obviously. Domo support is an admin. So now an admin can change your roles. They can change your protections. So our auditors were very concerned about, well, can a Domo support person alter our access and then get access to things they shouldn't do? So we actually tag the Domo account as an external source, and we have a separate page that tells us when did they log in, what did they do, and as soon as they do it, it flags it to our auditors, and we can watch every step Domo support takes in our instance. And that proved to the auditors that yes, they have access, yes, they're external, but we also know everything they do. So it actually turned out to be acceptable to the auditors because we're monitoring it and we're tracking the history of it. Something goes wrong, we can take action immediately. One of the things that I don't think people use enough that really helped to solve a lot of these problems is the use of alerts, Domo's alert functionality. This has come a long way in recent years. Many of the things we're monitoring, single sign-on, new users, activity by external users, we actually have set up alerts so that when this information changes, we're not monitoring a bunch of charts and tables. We're just doing our normal job, and when something needs to be addressed, we get an alert for it. The ability to truly define the alerts and what they say and what they tell you has been outstanding for us to define what's going on and have a record. We now have an email record with a history of the alert to show the auditors. Here's every time something happened, and here's the email trail of what was done to address it when that thing happened. The monitoring of external users. Now, having an external user, this is the whole discussion about the Domo support. While we have Domo support, we also have some other companies who actually have access to our accounts as well. So we can tag all these external users, and through the activity logs, cover everything they've done from the moment they logged in to the moment they logged off. And every time they do that, we get the alert, we check in on that alert, and we can say, well, did you call them? Did you ask them to come in and do that? And there's only 2 or 3 of us that are the contacts with Domo support. So we can actually bounce off the activity we're seeing due to the alert. We didn't monitor it, we got alerted when they went in, and then we can contact the people and say who asked them to come in and did they do what you wanted them to do. That's how we covered access to our information by external users. Through this whole discussion, there was really nothing specific about controlled unclassified information or classified information or SEC information or ITAR information. It's the general rules that everybody kind of forgets about. So what did we learn? How do you identify? What are the requirements for controlling your sensitive information? That's basically defined by what is the information you're trying to control. There's a regulation, there's a standard, there's some document that tells you you must do ABC to the system, but you better define the system correctly, the physical system and the functional system, or else you don't have a starting point. We also learned how do you design and implement and document the required controls in Domo. And documentation is very important. You have to prove it to the auditor. While some of the implemented controls are access and functionality and role-based settings, a lot of the actual implementation is training for your users so they understand what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. How do you ensure all your users are trained and certified and access that control information is really controlled? Again, part of that is regardless of the type of information, you train your individuals, see that the accounts are set up correctly, and then you must ensure that your users are following the information that you train them on. You must monitor them and have evidence that you've monitored them. And again, doesn't matter what kind of information it is. You set up your rules, you trained your users, you monitored and make sure they were following your rules. And then, how do you monitor and manage the controls you've implemented? We found alerts was a great solution for this. We don't actively review a bunch of tables and charts every day. We basically monitor the targeted information by setting up alerts that tell you when to look where to figure out what's been going on in your instance. And then the alert itself gives you the documentation history of when did something happen. The alert is your notification, and your email response to the people who did it is your evidence that you followed up every time an alert was flagged. So you've got the complete picture. What did you do? You trained them how to do it. You monitored they were doing it correctly, and then you monitored the overall system. So the key takeaways, regardless of your company's rules for inclusion or exclusion of given types of information, your instance and your infrastructure should be set up so you know what you're supposed to be doing. You've structured it, how it's supposed to be controlled, and all your users are trained in what does that mean. You should have defined all of your information that is to be contained in your instance and what information is prohibited. So not just what's there, but what's not allowed to be there. You also need to make sure you've implemented the safeguards and you're sure your permissions and your restrictions are in place and solid. They have to be maintainable, monitored, and approved by the people who own the data. You also need to make sure that your administrators and users have been properly trained to perform their specific roles. We have an individual training packet for each of the roles. Each one builds on the next. So if you're Major Domo, you would have taken all of the different training aspects all the way up to maximum access. And then you have to create the documentation and training and audit trail artifacts. So the fact that you have all this set up, you've controlled all your data, you've monitored all your data. If you don't have the artifacts of the documentation to present to the auditor to prove that you've done what the regulations require you to do, Doesn't matter how perfect it is, you're still going to fail the audit because you don't have any evidence. So you must document that evidence and have that available for the auditor. Anticipate the auditor's questions and prepare to show him evidence that you've taken care of it. Thank you very much for your time. We've learned a whole lot in our audits and our failures and our successes. So I hope I was able to help you address some of those things about controlling your sensitive information that most people forget about. It's not just the rule of the regulation. It's how you set up the system and all those little things people forget about. Proving to the auditor you've done your job. Again, thank you for your time, and I hope I was able to help you.